Okay, as promised, here is video number 2. Sorry for it being dimly lit. There was I know it's kind of grainy and there's lights a little streaky. I filmed this on my computer, so it's not amazing video quality. There was a streaky light, so I turned it off. So hopefully I come across okay. But what I want to do in this video, and the first one might be a little bit longer, just trying to give kind of a understanding of the book of John, but we're going to walk through the I am statements of Jesus. And the reason I want to do this is because the I am statements of Jesus all have a kind of a profound, they're all significant in the sense that they claim Jesus as God, but they connect him to characteristics of God in the Old Testament. And then what they do is something unique for us is they're all displaying the way God relates to us and what he means to us. And so you'll even see that a little bit today, but just want to give you guys, like I said, some context to the book of John so that as leaders, if you so choose, you can be a little more equipped going into your small group to answer some of these questions. And if you want to dive a little bit more into the study side of the book of John, then you can. So like I said in the previous video, I think that John is one of the greatest literary works of all time. The way things are weaved together, both with the Old Testament and even with its own book and the way it's laid out, there is, every time I read the book of John, there's so much complexity to it that I feel like I am just, every time I read it, I feel like I'm just scratching the surface, and I'm learning something new every time. So some unique things about the book of John, which again might not help that much with discussion, but John sets up his entire book like a court case. So what you actually see is it's almost like his the beginning is like his opening statement. It's like he's making his claim about Jesus, and then he wants his book to weigh in like a court case. Here is what the opposition thinks, and then here's what people for him think. But you also notice this unique contrast between look at the characters who accept and reject Jesus. Because a lot of times when you read the book of John, the rejection comes from the people who were supposed to accept him. The religious leaders, the Jewish people, they're the ones rejecting him, and then a lot of acceptance comes from Gentiles or people on the outside or less educated. And so it's like this flipping of what's expected or what's supposed to be. And so it has some unique elements there. But then throughout this, John is just, even from the very start of the book, he says, in the beginning, which is a direct connection to the Old Testament. It's connection to Genesis 1. So, and he starts different in the beginning, and then you'd think I've heard that before, but instead of saying in the beginning God created, it says in the beginning was the Word. And so he does all this Old Testament connection, which is just incredible. It's truly amazing when you get to see some of these things. And then this is something that I might have heard before, but I think I've kind of started realizing for the first time last night, is that all of these I am statements that Jesus makes to people, like this first one we're going to get here tonight, Jesus is the bread of life, and it's going to talk about manna in the Old Testament. It's also in relation to something that Jesus has just done or some kind of context in the book of John. Like I said, this is so layered, right? So you've got court cases and how this book is set up, but then you've also got statements connecting to the Old Testament, but also in response to miracles. So it's layered. But so Jesus feeds the 5,000, and then he's going to, in a moment, refer to himself as the bread of life, who can feed people miraculously, much like Jesus did in the Old Testament. So here's the picture we have. Jesus, he's sitting down at the lake. He feeds 5,000. You've probably heard this story. The disciples are we don't need food. They get the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, and Jesus breaks them apart, and they feed a ton of people, and everyone's amazed that Jesus was able to do this. Where did the food come from? How did he make this happen? A miracle by Jesus. And then, right after he walks on water, again, shows that Jesus, another miracle, and then he gets to the bread of life. And so there's this conversation that Jesus is asking, and it says that, I'll just read it for you real quick. When they found him on the other side of the lake, they asked him, Rabbi, when did you get here? Jesus answered, very truly I tell you, you were looking for me, not because you saw the signs I performed, but because you ate the loaves and had your fill. Do not work for food that spoils, but for food that endures to eternal life. The Son of Man will give you. For for on him God the Father has placed his seal of approval. Then they asked him, what must we do for the work God requires? Jesus answered, the work of God is this, to believe in the one who he has sent. So then they asked him, what signs then will you give me that we may see and believe? What will you do? Our ancestors ate manna in the wilderness, as it is written, he gave them bread from heaven to eat. Then Jesus said to them, very truly I tell you, it is not Moses who has given you the bread from heaven, but it is the Father who gives you the true bread from heaven. From the bread of God is the bread that comes down from heaven and gives life into the world. And then they said, sir, they said, always give us this bread. And then Jesus declared, I am the bread of life. Whoever comes to me will never go hungry. Whoever believes in me will never be thirsty. But as I told you, you have seen me and you still do not believe. And this is a super long passage, so it goes on more between this conversation. But here's basically what happens is Jesus does a miracle and the people are kind of like it's this constant tension between Jesus is like, I do miracles and yet you still don't believe. Like he's like, sometimes you just don't have, you have hard hearts. You're not going to believe. Things aren't going to change. It doesn't matter how many miracles I do. You still won't change. And he's like, you don't believe the prophets. You won't believe me. So there is kind of this, like Jesus does some of these signs and wonders to kind of confirm his authority as God. And also to, take excuse away from the people that are questioning him. But this statement specifically, why it's so significant and what I want to get at with the students is it is connecting to, and they even address it here, to manna in the Old Testament. Now, if you don't know, God's people were freed from Egypt in the Exodus. They're wandering on the desert. They don't have food. And then God gives them manna from the sky. Manna literally translates to what is it? Because the people were like, it's like wafers that it's like a breadish type wafer that's like bread that's just raining down from the heavens. So they're like, what is this? So they just called it manna. And God would provide them just enough for each day. And this is kind of amazing because like when you're wandering a desert with no food supply and your only food supply comes from a bread that falls from heaven that like spoils the next day. Like people would try and store up and save it and then it would spoil overnight and get like maggots and stuff. And so they said like they literally just had to trust God each day to provide for them. And this was frustrating, right? Like you wake up and you're like, I hope God doesn't forget about us tomorrow. Like, I hope he's going to take care of us. And so they would wake up and they'd be like, or they would go to sleep and be like, is there going to be manna on the ground tomorrow? And so, and I don't know how long this went on, and they were people that constantly complained, and they complained about getting bored of the manna and whatnot, but it was that the Israelite people would constantly have to completely trust in God to be their provider. And now I think what's happened in today's age is we live in a world of abundance of food. So we don't really ever even think about where our next meal is going to come from. We actually, it's funny, we think more about limiting our calories than we do about if we're going to get enough, which is just that is like a new concept in human history because of the way we've mass-produced food. And so we don't really trust God for sustenance and to provide for us. But what Jesus is saying here is, like, they understood very clearly in this culture, like, food is determined by crops, and crops are determined by weather and nature, and all that is determined by God. So there was this clear distinction between, like, food is determined by if God provides. And so the Israelite people, they would basically have to turn to God and be like, we trust you, provide for us. And God had a history of doing this, of providing for them. And this is something I think we miss, that we have the opportunity to daily wake up and go, God, provide for us. Now, it's hard because we don't ever really question where our food comes from, but we still have to connect that our food, our sustenance, our spiritual provision, our strength for the day, the Spirit working in us, like that is all provided by God. And in the same way, like Jesus does this miracle, he's multiplying the bread, and they're like, how did you do this? How are you doing this miracle? And he's like, I am the bread of life. I am the sustenance. Like this manna that you're talking about, this bread from heaven, this provision from the Lord, all this stuff that you're expecting. He's like, that is me. I am the thing you need. I am the thing that provides you with sustenance. I am I'm the thing that provides you with life. And he's making this more than just physical. He's like, yeah, sure, like God will take care of your physical needs, but he's like, I'm taking care of your spiritual needs. I'm providing what you need to be right with God daily. And so turn to me, be provided for, and I am the bread of life. Like whoever comes to me will not be hungry and will not be thirsty. And so he makes this connection to a God of the Old Testament that it's like, as long as the people were loyal to following God and willing to trust him, God provided food and water in the desert. It might have been scary at times, but God's like, I'm still going to come through and I'm still going to provide for you. And he never fails in that. And in the same way, God will provide for us every need that we have. And this doesn't mean like, it's like, I think sometimes we make this intent of like, well, I want a 401k and I want, like wealth and a big house and all this stuff. And it's like, God didn't necessarily guarantee excess. He didn't guarantee wealth and riches and all this stuff. And he's not like about this prosperity gospel, but God does say that he's going to take care of his children. And so we just have to trust that there's sometimes where things are scary and it doesn't make sense, and whether it be emotional or spiritual or physical, but learning to trust God is the best thing that you can do with your life, to wake up every day and go, you sustain me, you provide me in every area of my life. And so I trust you and you alone. And so that's what this is all about, but it's done through this kind of retelling of the people in the wilderness with manna and him being the bread of life and the miracles that he does in front of the people and providing food for them miraculously. And he's going like, I am the bread of life you need. I am not a food source. I am the bread of life. I'm the thing that sustains you. And that is something unique about this whole series. Every statement Jesus make, the definitive article there is the. It's not I am the. I am the greatest, the provider, the thing you need. So, yeah, that's that. Again, if you want to do more digging, this is just a brief overview, but there is articles and there is plenty of information out there. Just Google, I am the bread of life background. I am the bread of life connection to the Old Testament. How does this make sense in the context of John 6? Whatever it is. There are so many Google searches where you can find out so much more information if you're curious. And like I said, I'm just scratching the surface here, but just wanted to give you guys a little bit of overview as you go into your groups tomorrow. Sorry, this video went a little bit longer than I expected. I promise my sermon will not go over tomorrow. My goal is to keep it 30 minutes. I'll do it. I will.